Are we rolling?
We're good to go.
Welcome, everybody. I think we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance, and I see Georgia Carter back there, and she usually starts it at OLV. Why don't you come up here and help us? It's better you than us. They want to hear from you, so right there. We'll all face the flag over there. It's right on, and you could start it, Georgia.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, and liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. So if we could call this meeting to order and a roll call from you, Clerk Smith. Sure.
Mayor Turnbull.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Moraski Brown.
Here.
Councilmember Carter.
Here.
Councilmember Janetti.
Here.
Councilmember Krentz.
Here. Great. We have a full group up here today. So again, we're meeting in accordance with the Governor's Office Open Meetings Act here tonight. Know when you come up to give your comments, you're giving us the authority to have your voice and your video on our recording. So tomorrow morning, you can see how you did in the whole bit and everybody else. So when you come up to do that, you are giving us permission. So with that, I have an agenda in front of you. I'm looking for the approval of the agenda. Do I have that on the table here?
I move to approve the agenda as submitted.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the agenda. Do I have support? We have support. Any other discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Great. We have an agenda. Public comment. So tonight we have two major things on the agenda. If you're here for that, I will open it up after that. If you're here to talk anything about the water, that's going to be a whole section. So wait for that. We're going to have a little section on the auditing, that we passed with flying colors. I think that they're going to tell us. But if you're here about the numbers of the financials, I will open it up after that. If there's anything else other than water and the audit, this would be the time to come up for public comment. If you have it, this would be at 3 minutes and we'll go from there. Going once. Yeah, right now, this would be the time. And your full name and address in the whole bit. Yep, this would be the time. Sorry about that.
All right, my name is Dominic Giovanni. I live at 443 River Street. Is it picking up the mic? Is that?
Yeah, just put it up a little bit. He's a tall man. We do that because at home they can hear you and on video. And
All right, my name is Dominic Giovanni. I live at 443 River Street, Northville, Michigan. I want to read this letter so it's on a public record. On September 24, 2024, I noticed a woman across the street from my house on the downside of the River Street fence looking at the air monitor. I walked over and tried to ask her some questions over the fence. She said she was not allowed to talk to me. I shared my feelings about the air monitoring and that I wasn't happy with no response from the city. On October 27th, 2024, a letter from Kyle Konwinski, the Dust case lawyer, had to be signed by me because it was certified. I was shocked to see it included a cease and desist demand from the developer attorney that stated a police report had been filed on me by Cheyenne Fantoski Wendell. I went right to City Hall to get a copy of the police report written by Captain Kruger. For some reason, the report wasn't filed until October 9, 2024, 2 weeks later than it supposedly happened. And then Cheyenne said no to the question if she felt threatened or felt violence was possible. She also said she did not intend to file a report, but was pressured by her supervisor, Rodney, who had talked to Scott. He is a person that I never saw from the side of my chain link fence and the dark screening on it. According to the police report, Cheyenne reported it under pressure to report it to the city building inspector, Scott Weaver, who then reported, as the police report states, to others at City Hall. Eventually, it made it to Captain Kruger, where she told him I did not want to file the police report, nor did she feel threatened or in danger. I would like to mention that I broke no laws. I did not trespass. I did not yell or threaten. I just asked questions and made comments. This is the way it was handled by others in City Hall is very questionable. It makes me wonder if I'm being targeted by city officials for using my rights to free speech, or are the others in the City Hall that Scott Weaver reported to, who in City Hall contacted and potentially pressed Captain Kruger about this matter. What is the person, an elected official, upper level administrator, or someone else? Why was there a 2-week delay before the police report was filed as an assault case? My concern is not with Captain Kruger. He serves Northville residents with integrity. I am formally requesting an investigation into potential misconduct by an elected official or employee of the city as outlined in the City of Northville Standard of Conduct and Ethics. I also request that this be conducted by an independent panel and does not include elected officials or employees of the city to be fair and void of conflict of interest. As you know, you all have received these 10-page reports. So that's all I wanted to do. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And we'll get the Chief Masek involved if he's not already. Great. Thank you. If there's anything else, this is a time other than if you're here for water or if you're here for the audits that we did on the city. If it's not either of those two, this would be the time. Going once, going twice. Okay, I am closing off number 4. And again, I see some rare frequent flyers here. As you come in, this is kind of the agenda. I'm your guide as you go through the agenda. We're through the first 4 sections: pledge, call to order, the approval of the agenda, and the public comment. And we all have, if it was written comment, and we got those comments. If anybody put something in before 4 o'clock today, we have that in our packages. I expect everybody to read every word in their packages. Let's go to number 5, presentations. The first presentation is from the audit group, and I believe we are, Sandy, would you like to introduce your guest here? That would be outstanding. I believe from Rehmann, and it's Daniel Clark, if I remember correctly, but I'll let you.
Yes, want to introduce Daniel Clark from Rehmann. They are our first-year auditors. Previously, we were with a different firm. So I will just let Daniel take over from here.
Right. Daniel, welcome. We'll be easy on you in the Hobbit as a first-timer. Go right ahead.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Duly noted.
So good evening. Yes, as it was just stated, my name is Daniel Clark. I'm the signing principal on the engagement. I believe there's a presentation that's going to be
He is catching up.
coming up. Okay. So you would have received a couple documents, one of which was the draft financial statement. The other was a board communication letter. And then we put together a presentation which kind of summarizes both of those documents. So I'm going to walk through this,
Great.
but happy to answer any questions that you have on those specific
Excellent.
documents if I don't address them with the presentation. So tonight we are presenting on your fiscal year end, June 30th, 2024. You can go to the next slide. A couple of the key team members, I introduced myself, but the 2 senior managers, one of which was in charge of the field work, was Dan Merritt. And then Tracy Kendall was actually involved with preparing the financial statements along with the finance department. Slide 3, we can go to now. So these are the required board communications and some financial highlights, and then we'll go through some of the specifics behind this. But first and foremost, with any audit, I'm excited to hear what type of opinion they're going to be getting. So we are issuing an unmodified or a clean opinion on your financials, which is exactly what you received in the past. That's the highest opinion that we can give. So again, happy to communicate that today. Number 2, then we're also asked to communicate any audit findings or anything related to that. And happy to state that there were no findings this year again. So there were no significant deficiencies, material weaknesses, or other matters to note. And then furthermore, we do occasionally have to propose certain audit adjustments, but the records that were provided to us were clean, and there were no even audit adjustments that were needed. So I will commend the staff here in the city for keeping very clean books, and it was a very easy transition. I know it's sometimes bringing in a new audit firm, there's a lot of extra work, which there was this year, but we felt like that transition went very well. So we appreciate the staff, Sandy and her team. Moving to number 3 now, these are a couple of things that we want to highlight in your financial statements. So first, we did note that the city's assets, entity-wide, so this is all funds, both governmental and business type activities, you had an increase of about 5.6 million or 9% in assets. And I'll talk a little bit about what those changes were part of. We're also happy to state your liabilities were reduced by about 2.6 million or 26%. And again, I've got charts after this that walk through those. Secondly, your property taxes saw an increase of about 570,000. or an increase of 8%. And the city recognized approximately 952,000 in investment returns. As interest rates have increased, obviously, that's been a source of income for cities again, which in the past has been minimal to none. So happy to see that of investments are earning some interest in the last couple of years. Thirdly, so general fund obviously is an important indicator of the health of a city. So happy to state that the fund balance increased about 362,000 or 9%. And your current fund balance coverage ratio, which what that represents is we take your fund balance and we compare that to a year's worth of expenditures in the general fund. And you're currently sitting at around 31%. Also, significant investments in infrastructure were noted this year. So you had about 2.2 million in governmental activity capital asset additions. And then the business type or the BTA or the water sewer, the refuse recycling, et cetera, you had about 1.2 million in capital additions for fiscal year 24. And then lastly, pension liability. Always an important thing to talk about the funding status of that. The city is in a really healthy position where you're at 97% funded, which a lot of municipalities would love to have these types of funding levels. And then furthermore, your OPEB or your other post-employment benefit liability, which is your retiree healthcare, et cetera, is actually overfunded and currently sitting at 159%. So those are numbers to be proud of. And again, all very positive results here. So going to some of the details, if you go to slide 4. So this is the first item that I noted. So the city had 65.2 or 65.3 in assets, an increase of that 5.6 million, as I stated. I'll talk about a couple of the items on this page. Cash and investments increased about 1.4 million. You had receivables increase by about 2.5. Most of that increase is a result of there was a new tower lease that was entered into. So those are long-term leases and we record the net present value of the entire thing and then it gets amortized over that life. So that was a significant reason why your receivables increased this year. And then your net OPEB, which is an asset. So again, I was talking about that over 100% funded. You're currently sitting on a net OPEB asset of just under 4.5 million. And that improved from last year, almost $3 million. Going to slide 5, we talked about your liabilities. So the city had 7.6 million in liabilities compared to last year of 10.2 or 10.3. So your liabilities increased, or I'm sorry, decreased by about 2.6 million. The biggest driver here, you'll see right there on your long-term debt was one of the drivers. There was no new debt that was entered into this year. You did obviously pay for your annual payments. So that debt decreased about 423,000. And then your net pension liability, which I said, again, was funded at 97%, improved significantly by about $3.2 million. Most, again, the result of that was very positive investment returns during the year for both your pension liability and your OPEB.
Right.
Going on to slide 6, we talked about your largest revenue source, which is property taxes. So you'll see that line shows the change in this year over year for the last 4 years. So the city received about 7.7 million in property taxes, an increase over last year of 7.1. So a nice increase as your property taxes continue, or I'm sorry, the property values continue to increase. That number has increased since 2021 and I think further back than that as well. But obviously this is just showing back to 2021. You did have some increases in your intergovernmental revenue. So you had about $1 million related to some ARPA contributions from the county, I believe. So that's what drove your intergovernmental revenues to about $2.9 million for 2024, up from last year of 1.6. Slide 7 continues on with just 2 other significant revenue line items that the city experiences. So that top line is charges for services. That had a nice increase over last year. You're currently sitting at 1.9 million in charges for services. And then that contributions, I know you did receive some contributions this year related to some development. And that went from about 400,000 last year to 1.2 million this year. Now we'll talk about your general fund, specifically on slide 8. So all the way over to the right there, 2024. So for financial statement purposes, there are some smaller funds that get grouped up for financial statement presentation. So the first 2 bars in each of these columns represents the combined, but the true general fund are the last 2. So that like turquoise color, we're currently sitting at about 3.9 million in fund balance for the entire fund. 2.9 of that, which is unassigned, so again, can be spent on general operations of the city. And that's where I was saying that number compared to your expenditures, you're sitting at that 31% down at the bottom that I've listed there. That has fluctuated a little bit, but not by very much. Last year, you were at 32%, but back in 21, you were at 26%. So again, have held that steady and held that above the 30% mark. And then we'll talk on slide 9 about your water sewer, your refuse and recycling. So you'll see over the last couple of years has remained very steady in most of these. That top line is your water and sewer. You're currently sitting at 3.8 million in water and sewer revenue, about a $75,000 increase over last year, but very steady year over year for all 3 of these categories. And then I think we have 2 more financial slides.
Great.
One relates to net pension liability on slide 10. So this is that all the way over to the right, you'll see you had total pension liability of 21 million. You have assets that are invested that go against that of 20.6. So the unfunded portion is that 711,000. So 97%, you'll see that increased about 15% over last year's 82% funding. And as investment returns have been very successful over the last couple of years, you'll see that has what's driven that funding percentage up. So very positive results there. And then lastly, slide 11 is the OPEB liability, or in your case, an asset. Again, all the way over to the right, you were 159% funded in 2024. So your assets in the plan of 12.1 million exceeded the liability of 7.6 by about $4.5 million. Again, something that other cities would be very pleased to have that.
Yes.
All right, lastly, slide 12, some required board communications I wanted to end with. We do assess accounting estimates related to depreciation expense, allowance on doubtful accounts, those inputs that go into calculating your pension and your OPEB. We assess those and deem those all to be reasonable. Again, I mentioned this at the beginning, we encountered no difficulties while performing the audit. All the questions we asked were answered appropriately and timely, and documentation was provided thoroughly. We do issue a report over internal controls over financial reporting. And as I stated, there were no findings. And then there was one new accounting pronouncement that was adopted this year related to GASB 100. There were a couple changes in major funds. And if you look through the financial statements, there's a note talking about that. But GASB, I just wanted to communicate that was implemented this year. So with that, the last slide just has upcoming accounting pronouncements that we will work with the city as they become applicable. So I just wanted to communicate that these are coming up in the next couple of years. But other than that, that was the end of the official presentation.
Great.
But happy to
Let me start by thanking you. I've spent some quality time with you and your team in the office here, and I thank you for going through everything in detail with me, a couple of weeks ago. It being the first year, I think you guys spent even more time and you went through every account. And I know our staff with Sandy was there to help you in every step of the way. But I thank you for all the time. You took over all the rooms downstairs. We appreciate that.
That's what we do. We fill up space.
You filled up a lot of space, and you did a great detailed job. And this just hits the high points, but there's a lot of detail behind. But thank you for that. I know you and I met already. Others.
Yeah, couple quick things I wanted to point out. I mean, first, clean report on the financials with no additional findings is phenomenal. So I will start with a thank you to Sandy and all of our city staff, because that is a team effort to achieve that. And I know a lot of work goes into that effort and the forecasting associated. But few comments. 2021, we were at 77% on our pension funding. We are now at 97%. 120 is the target, not 100%. So I know I say this like every 6 months, but I think it's a really important thing that we maintain the excess contributions, because if we can get to 100%, then we're not at the whims of a fluctuating market. We are fully funded, and then that actually will open up significant cash flow to the city. Another point, obviously the OPEB going from 101 in 2021 to 159 is phenomenal. So that is exciting news. But the thing that I jumped on was in 2021, we were at, I think it was 2021, we were at 26% for our general fund, and we're now at 31%. I know a lot of factors go in, and we'll get into this probably later, of what equates to a AAA bond rating. But one of those factors that we directly control, and one of our goals several years ago that we set, was to get our general fund to 30%. To have that above, because that is a key factor in our bond rating, which ultimately reduces interest rates, which saves the city money. So maintaining that 30%, first getting there and then maintaining that 30% in our general fund is critical. We're going to have a lot of decisions coming up. We're going to have to think about trade-offs because we got to stay at that 30% line. And then the last thing that I was going to highlight, the property tax revenue increasing by 8%. We maintain Headley in Northville. I think what we're seeing from all this data is that we can properly manage our finances and keep Headley in place, which caps the property tax rise year over year. An elimination of Headley could cause our property taxes to skyrocket, which is what we've seen in a lot of other communities. We are right now able to manage this without having to look at going down that road. I think we need to maintain that. When we see an increase of 8%, that's actually driven a lot by increased property taxes and then new homes and turnover. Because new homes is obviously additional revenue into the city. And then if somebody sells their home to a new person, it gets readjusted and the tax revenue goes up. It's not that across the board, everyone is seeing an 8%. In fact, Headley is capping that. So we aren't seeing that increase. So overall, I think it's a phenomenal report. And it seems like we're continuing to put ourselves in a pretty good position long term. We just have to keep focused on getting that pension number to up to 120 and keeping that general fund at least 30% going forward.
Great. Others from council?
One question for you. So there was a comment on ARPA and we don't want to get a sugar addiction to, let's say, one-time fund hits. Can you comment on, even if you were to pull out anything associated to one-time funding opportunities from the state or federal level, if the processes that we have in place and the financial stewardship we have is sound, independent of any outside money that won't come again?
Yeah, so based on what we saw is that most of those one-time funding were for specific purposes and projects. So obviously, the thing that was being cautioned to everyone during this ARPA process was don't use it for something that you're going to continue to have to fund if there's not a funding source that comes after. So I don't believe from what we saw that the city has put themselves in the position where they're funding an ongoing expenditure. So
because I know some other entities even made the news about ongoing expenses increasing and ended up in a $25 million debt hole because that money didn't go on into perpetuity. But your assessment is the plans we have in place are really the high level output that we're having here is independent of that.
correct, yes.
Yeah, I think that's very important. So then based also on fresh eyes from yourself, is there anything that you're seeing that we're deficient in that we're not doing with respect to ongoing financial health of the city?
No, I mean, as I stated, obviously, there's always room for improvements. There were no official findings. Obviously, there's best practices that we bring to the table as we're discussing certain things. It has to rise to a level where we feel like it would need to be printed. So as we went through things, obviously, there were recommendations from a verbal standpoint. We're like, hey, have you ever considered this? So I mean, there were those things that were built into the process, but nothing that rose to the
More
level.
procedural.
Correct.
In terms of
Yes.
what you do. Okay. And then I just want to also thank Sandy. I think every year I've been here, it's been a clean audit. It's been a glowing review, and I think the city should be absolutely proud to have her, what she's doing. And then also with the stewardship of George and the mayor and the people that came before us who made financial responsibility the top priority, and it remains our number one priority. And it is showing through based on what Councilmember Carter and I'm sure others are going to say. So I really appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes. Would you like to?
Unless council has another comment, I don't want to jump the gun.
No, everything was covered. It was the bond rating. That was good news. And of course, Sandy delivers this every year in terms of this clean audit. So no, I'm all set.
It is all yours, George.
Just a quick comment. Thank you to our auditors. A new auditor comes in and, you want to make sure that the things that we've seen in the past, which was our auditors in the past have said, we have one of the most well-prepared staff in terms of preparation for the audit that they've ever seen, and that was a great compliment. And then a new auditor comes in and says the same thing. So that is a great testimony to our staff, to their professionalism, and to Sandy and her leadership in the department, to their thoroughness. So I think from two fronts here, council can feel great. One is that the financial systems and the reliability and the data you're getting is all very good. And that was shown, obviously. But also that the financial leadership of council and the conservative and setting money aside and making sure you're funding those obligations for pension and OPEB and making sure the city is financially stronger in the future. And you see that as well. One thing I will note is everyone gives you a different number for pension funding. So MERS says it's 104%. The auditor says 97%. And I think the state of Michigan says we're like 95% or something. They just use different assumptions, same numbers, different smoothing of assets, different assumptions, but it's all the same basic answer, which is we're doing very well. So we got to keep moving along in that.
But not there
round.
yet, right?
What's that? We're not there yet. You got to keep moving.
You want 120%? I got it.
20%. But thank you to Sandy and the finance staff and to all the managers for their work and leadership. And also thank you to the auditors and council for your leadership. Thanks.
Sandy, we can't say enough about you and Cindy and the staff, each and every day. Just grow more money trees back there and we'll be even happier. But thank you so much.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good.
Just an informational update, no motion on that today. So we will.
In the consent agenda is a motion that accepts the audit.
Right.
So that will come if council has no issues with it.
Right.
That will come as a part of your approval of the
I am
consent
getting
agenda.
that right now. So that's why there's no motion here. It's in the consent agenda. And we're going to number 6. But is there anybody in the audience that has any financial comments? Going once? Going twice? Great. Thank you for being here. So let's go to number 6 on your score sheet out there. Consideration of approving the consent agenda. And as city manager just mentioned, the approval of this audit is there. And these are things that Northville Youth Network updates, the minutes, and I would ask for the minutes, are they okay from your standpoint? Holiday to remember, special event, other things, but Barbara, how
I
are
had
the?
I had one comment.
Sure,
I don't think
absolutely.
we have to pull it off the consent agenda, but for awareness.
Yes.
So the Housing Commission did approve a $20 for the 1-bedroom and $24 for the 2-bedroom increase in rent for Allen Terrace. That's a 2 and a 2.48. It's 2.5, but with rounding and getting into whole numbers. 2.48% increase for each. Great conversation with both the Housing Commission as well as with the residents on that. That is consistent with, it's actually the 2.48 is consistent a little bit below the Social Security increase. So one of the things that we're trying to maintain is covering the costs within Allen Terrace, but also recognizing that we have a lot of people that are on fixed incomes and we need to handle that appropriately. So great conversation. It was a unanimous vote on the Housing Commission, but did want to highlight it because it is an important decision that's made as part of the consent agenda.
And keep it low because, I want to be up there someday too. So, you really know 2%. Good. Excellent. Good.
Yeah,
Anything else on there?
Yeah, and just in terms of, it was mentioned that it's the consent agenda related to the audit is in here.
Right.
What's presented at us is a draft audit. So we accept it. And then what's in here is it becomes the final audit. So that's what the resolution is. But what is in the consent agenda.
Right.
So I don't think we need to
Right.
discuss.
No.
No.
Absolutely. Anything else on the consent? So I'm looking for a motion to go forward to accept the consent agenda. Do I have that motion?
So moved.
We have a motion. Do we have support of that motion?
I'll support it.
We have support. Any other discussion? Seeing none, I think we can all in favor say aye. All opposed, say nay. Great. We have path forward. The consent agenda is accepted. So going to number 7, if you're out there looking at the scorecard, public hearings, we don't have any tonight. Number 8, unfinished business. We finished all of our business. Number 9, new business. So eventually at the end of this will be talking about the water. So this is your time at the end of that. And we are going to give information and little presentations up to that point, and hopefully some of those answers will be there. So with that, why don't I toss it over to City Manager first?
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this is an important conversation regarding bonding for water infrastructure. If you think about all the things that City Council and projects we've worked on since I've been here, this water infrastructure project is likely the most important that we will tackle in the recent past or near future because of the implications for our water system. I've been here almost 2 years, and actually the conversation began in earnest about 2 years ago on the water system, and Mike is going to go through some of the details on that. When I first got here, Mike, who obviously understood the challenges we were facing, took me on a tour of the water facility and the tanks up there and the storage tanks, and explained some of the challenges we're having. And I think that council has been on top of this since that point and understood that there is a significant challenge here. And we've had a lot of steps along the way, including a water rate study and all things to sort of move us in the direction. But this is sort of the culmination or moving forward with 2 years of work at this point in discussion with the community to get to the point where we are ready to have the intent to bond, and then hopefully next summer beginning these very key projects for our water infrastructure. With that, instead of just doing the bonding from Mr. McGow, we wanted to have Mike come up and talk again about the presentation we did several months ago for council and the community, because we thought it was important with such a significant investment that we reiterate the importance of what this resource is going for, why it's important, the administrative consent order, the essentialness of it, and then obviously have a chance for the council to ask any more questions you have. We know you're familiar with it, but we thought it was an important step back before going to Pat McGow for talking about the specific intent. So with that, if Mike and Chris Ellenbach, our engineer from OHM, is the lead engineer on the project as well.
Remember, it's tri groups, us, the audience, and those online. So nice and loud.
Yep,
into
thank
that
you,
mic.
George.
Thank you.
Yep, so I have Chris here from OHM, who's been here already a few times to help present this presentation of our water improvements. What you'll see today is a little bit different from the last one. Last one was the 24 million, the full shebang of what we need replaced in the next 5 years, which includes our water reliability study, our ACO. Chris is going to go over a little bit of that detail. Go next slide. But I just wanted to start off with where we started. First, public outreach. We started this discussion actually back in November of 2022. That's with our ACO, with our underground reservoir. That's when we entered into an agreement with Eagle to take a look at the reservoir, the feasibility of it, and the recommended changes, in which that was to remove.
Could you just describe what an ACO is?
Yes, the ACO is Administrative Consent Order.
By the state.
By the state.
And what does that mean?
That we are obligated to, with that agreement, the actions that were agreed on, which is to eliminate that reservoir and put it out of service. That's what it was agreed on.
And I know you're going to get to it. That reservoir dates back to World War I, to the early teens, 1918, 1919.
Yep. Included in this presentation, we'll kind of go over some of the dates there. But yes, the mayor is right. That reservoir up there is over 100 years old. And most of the components from over 100 years ago are still there, still in service and being used. So in May of 2023, after going through this ACO and what the needs to replace this reservoir, we took that data plus our water reliability study that was performed in 2021 and came up with a large long-term replacement plan, which came out to $24 million. So we had a public notice on that, public meeting on that in May of 2023. Which actually still today is posted on our city website. All the data is available if anyone wants to go take a look at it. Since then, we had another meeting in April of 2024. This one was to talk about our water system improvements, but also the water and sewer rate study that was performed. Later that month in April, we actually discussed the water and sewer fund and the rates during our budget process. Since then, the water rates were implemented with changes. They were issued June 1st, which included a lot of information to the public through Northville Matters, social media, and also posted on our website. Once also in August, one of the first utility bills with the new rate, there was like a cheat sheet, a flyer explaining all these rate changes, which is also located on our website and available. Last thing I did not mention that's not on the slide is every community is required to put out a water quality report. If you notice the last 2 years, the very first paragraph explains the ACO and the process that we've been. First year was we entered to an ACO, we're taking a study. Second year explains that we're working on getting it replaced or removed. So that is notified, that's posted, that's mail delivered to every resident every year, posted on our website, health departments for both Wayne and Oakland County. You go next slide. So I'm gonna have Chris come on up and talk about the project needs for the water improvements.
Great. Chris, it's all yours. Thanks for being here tonight.
Yeah, glad to be here. So, yeah, just kind of want to go through kind of the need, and then I'll jump to what the project entails. You can jump to the next slide. So first off, just want to start with a history of the water system. So 1892, the original water system was created for the city of Northville. So 130 years, over 130 years ago, water flowed from the north, basically where the elevated tank is, where the underground reservoir is. There was just an open pond. And from there, by gravity, water flowed down to the lower sections of town. 1920, roughly, you mentioned, I don't think we've had an official date, but it's somewhere in 1918 to 1922 range. The underground reservoir, that's really the main focus of the consent order, was constructed. There was contamination from the farms and development north of town. They ended up putting in sand filters and then that reservoir. And until the 1960s, that reservoir was used to supply the city with water. 1960s, the city connects to Detroit water system. Basically that reservoir, the sand filter part was abandoned. Water now enters that reservoir from Detroit, now Great Lakes Water Authority. From there, it is pumped to the elevated tank, and then from the elevated tank goes out to the city. So if you can jump to the next slide. So I think Mike really kind of hit on a couple of the things, the consent order. That's the big piece. And that really focuses around the underground storage reservoir and creating proper pressure districts. So the other thing that was done in 2021, there was a consultant for the city of Northville that completed a water reliability study that identified a number of water improvements throughout the city. Most of those are focused on the infrastructure that's really over 100 years old. It's undersized. It's way past its useful life. And it's time to start replacing that infrastructure. And most of that is in the older area of town. Next slide. So kind of jumping to the focus of the consent order. So the underground reservoir is the pump house. So as I mentioned, water goes into the reservoir right now and it's pumped up to the elevated tank. The capacity of that reservoir is really not needed, but Eagle said, hey, you have significant deficiencies, kind of risks to the water system. It was all framed in that consent order, basically saying, hey, you're out of compliance. You have to get in compliance. We then performed the feasibility study with Mike and have said, hey, let's get this out of the water system completely and move on. The other piece of the consent order really ties to, in the 1960s, when the elevated tank was constructed, the city kind of has a lower area of town and a higher area of town. And in order to kind of manage water pressure over that change in grade, there was essentially two pressure districts created, a line essentially in the water system, and you manage flow across that line. The infrastructure that was put in, it's referred to there as PRVs, pressure reducing valves. None of those are functioning. And that was another concern. So Eagle's main concern is really, hey, on the south side of town, pressures at certain points in time, they get 120 PSI. Really, we're supposed to be 100 or less. And ideally even kind of in the 35 to 80 PSI range. And that's not possible right now. So next slide. I guess the other piece is really, a lot of it tying to that 2021 water reliability study, the water main replacement. So you have all these mains, they're 100 years old. They're all 4-inch, they're 6-inch. Currently, you would never go through a neighborhood without putting an 8-inch water main in the ground. Really, that's mainly tied to fire flow, having proper fire flow. You can see that I've literally never seen a hydrant like that before. I mean, it's old. That is really old stuff. And all that old infrastructure has a history of breaks. It costs Mike a lot to fix this stuff, to maintain it. And then finally, Mike didn't really touch on this, but obviously lead service lines and getting those out of the system. I think the city recently got a grant for up to $600,000. We're in the process of going through and really making sure we know where all those are and using that money. But as part of the state requirements, those need to get out of the system as well over the upcoming years. So that's kind of the overall big need. So if you can jump to the next slide. I just want to kind of hit on, so Mike laid out kind of some of the funding pieces and the timeline. A lot of that was tied to, we tried to go out and get a drinking water state revolving fund loan. A lot of the infrastructure money that came down from the federal government over the past 3-4 years, it was all being cycled through the state revolving fund. Problem is, everyone wanted that money. The state really focused on overburdened and disadvantaged communities. Unfortunately, the city, because of the way they scored those, was not able to receive that money. I mean, we submitted both in 23 and in 24, and both times landed outside the funding range. So here we are. We have to do this work. It's really, the infrastructure continues to get older. We're under the consent order. So that's where we're turning to the water revenue bonds with really the current notice for the 15 million. And I think there is an intent then in the future to get more money to continue with kind of that water main replacement. The big stuff for the consent order is really now the 2027. We're wrapping up design. We're going to go to bid in the spring. That big stuff is starting. And then you're really going to turn your attention to just all the local mains, getting proper looping, getting proper fire flow. Next slide. So now just kind of going through all the improvements. Next. So this phase 1 consent order work. So we already mentioned we're going to get rid of that underground reservoir. Right now, there's currently a booster station that sits on that reservoir. We will be replacing that booster station. We're going to put the booster station basically at East Street and Baseline next to the middle school there. There's basically the Baseline right away was abandoned, never used, it's vacant. We're going to use that right away to install a new booster station in that location. Along with that, we're going to basically put in 3 new pressure reducing valves. One of those will be right at the booster station. The other one is Potomac and Randolph. And then the third one is actually the south kind of feed there. The orange dot there is really the connection, our south connection to Great Lakes Water Authority. So we're going to take their water, reduce it where the feed is at that location. We're going to also replace water main along Baseline. That's really to connect all the new infrastructure in that location. And then we're looking at new water main along Katy Street, some of which is being funded by the developer. Next slide. So that first phase there kind of broken out with the estimates, we're looking at roughly $8.5 million of need to complete those projects. Next slide. The second phase, so this is kind of really more so 26, 27 work. There's a number of different projects, 7 Mile and Center, Linden, Eaton, River Street, Griswold, Lower Griswold. These are all areas, small, old infrastructure. And basically there's quite a long list of these streets that ultimately need to be replaced. We're trying to prioritize them to correspond to other work to ensure that we kind of take care. You know, if you look at that upper Griswold area, that's really a risky spot because we kind of have one water main going up into there. If anything breaks up there, the whole neighborhood is kind of out of water. So, you know, kind of identifying those. There is a subsequent plan to then finally loop that neighborhood. So I have 2 sources that would happen in a future, kind of that future money that we're looking at So phase two, right at about $5 million that we estimate for that work. Next slide. So really just kind of, why are we doing this overall? We have the ACO. We need to get in compliance with the regulatory agencies from the state. Reduce risk to public health, reduce risk to water quality, improve system reliability, decreased water main breaks, operating maintenance costs for Mike and his team. When water mains break, you lose water too. You also, these old pipes, they have leaks in them. You're constantly losing water when you have an old water system like you have here. And I think the last thing is if you continue to kind of go down this path of not doing this work, it's only gonna, this stuff is old. It's very old already. It's only getting older. So yeah, I think this is the third time I've been here delivering kind of the same message, but that pretty much sums it up. So any questions?
Thank you. Well, from our standpoint, I'll open it up. I know I got a kick out of those fire hydrants because the ones from Cabbage Town, we had some with 1898 stamped on them, and on Roger Street, 1918. So I got it. Some people wanted those, but we needed the parts because we don't have any of the parts. So the parts are in a pile down there. Isn't it unbelievable? We went through this. So growing up in this world, I'm a 1960 model, but in the late 50s, when we went on to like the city water, there was a huge thing like this too. No, all of our water came from down by Eaton Drive, that Joe Denton Park. That was one pond, and the other one was down on Baseline and Novi Road, or 8 Mile and Novi Road. We pumped those two ponds up into that big pond at one time. I've heard all the stories. I've seen those pictures. That picture, it looks like an ancient, Civil War picture. That's the way it looks like today. If you go up there, it is unbelievable. I've been touring that a little bit. And that tank, and Eagle says, we got to get rid of that tank, period, in the near future. So I thank you for all the work on that. But yeah, people don't realize in the late 50s, when I think the second mayor up there was around Allen, it was a huge deal to upgrade our infrastructure for the next 50 or 60 years. We haven't really done anything for the last 50 or 60 years. Now it's time to update it for the future. So thank you for all the work. The third or fourth time I've heard this is outstanding. Other comments, other questions from?
Maybe I'll start us off with a few things. And I might bring in some of the bond terms on that. If it's too soon, I can wait on that. But the root cause of this is the system is the first generation system. It's ancient. And unlike, let's say, Northville Township has to be replaced. The people who sat here, the generations before us, did minimal, if nothing, to maintain it. We have now received a ACO from the state, not an ACR. It's not a request, it's an order, which is a thou shalt, correct? This must happen.
Yep.
Okay. So I have no joy in spending this amount of money on this, but this is what's in front of us. And I know we've been talking about it in public forum for over 2 years. And this is, I think, the third or fourth time that you've been here to discuss it. This is probably the biggest thing that we're going to do while we're here. The three L's I've always looked at, basically the context of your message are looping, lead, and leaks. And we have to address all of those because we have become a lot smarter on handling the complex system of hydraulics, water architecture, pressure, leaks. And the couple reasons why we have to do this now is in my day job, labor and materials is going up way beyond the revenue we have available. So if you're going to do a capital outlay on something that's going to last decades, you do it now, not later. Especially if we have an ACO from the state that's pointing at us. And then we're going to get into, in a matter of short order, the discussion of the bond. So I'm sure there's a lot of concern in the community and I see it and I know it. I'm keenly aware. My number one priority as long as I'm here is fiscal stewardship. I want to leave this city in a better place when I'm done for the next person and next people to come in. And I think we're on the cusp of some really good things. So there'll be some questions on why are we spending so much in bonding this? And I think you covered that. Is the spends on this are 15 million. The first tranche will be 15 million over 3 years. So in order to pay for that, the money has to be available. And there's no scenario where a city with a general fund budget of 9-ish million will have 15 million on hand now to handle that. Therefore, no matter what we do on any other spends in and around town, you have to bond in order to have that capital. Mike, stop me at any point, or George or Sandy, correct? So if $15 million was sitting here in a savings account, that would be delinquent, I would say. That's way too much capital to have in place and to have not spent it at this point. So the only possible outcome here is to bond this and then bond it over such a time frame that it lasts something along the lines of the length of use of the capital improvement that you're making, correct? So this is the 20 years plus. So that we're paying it down. And oh, by the way, we're gonna have 800 new neighbors who are gonna help us pay for it as well once they move in too. The design of the system is already capable of accepting the downs. This work is independent of anything to do with the downs. We've already designed that. This had to happen no matter what, whether the downs was there or a racetrack was there. Is that correct as well?
Yeah, if anything, there's a slight reduction in true storage. You know, we're taking storage offline because we can take it offline. We can use just the elevated storage tank. We don't need. So if anything, there's actually kind of a true slight reduction. Doesn't impact. Totally fine with future development and the next 20 years. And that's what the feasibility study really dived into.
So let's also, last thing here. So let's say there's a scenario where the system fails catastrophically. Could you see an outcome in this city where we do not have potable water for weeks or months until it gets repaired?
Not so much on your end. I mean, there just a few months ago, Great Lakes Water Authority had a pretty major break in town. The risk of this city losing water for a longer period of time is very likely tied to the transmission infrastructure that
GLWA.
feed off
Okay,
of.
all right, good. So let's get that out. Like, that's good.
Yeah.
So the key points here are, I hope everybody was listening, but the city is in a great shape financially. There was no scenario where we would have the capital available to spend down in 3 years on the outlays that we need to make, which is why you have to bond this out over a longer period of time. There was no other fiscal instrument that I'm aware of where this would be acceptable, that I know of. And maybe my fellow council members can make me smarter, but having thought of it, that's about it. So I think that's clear, and I wanted to hammer that home too. This is not something I enjoy doing. This is necessary. And this is what we'll say a long-term generational improvement to our infrastructure that I think we can all be proud of. And then with respect to the bonding, George, can you speak to, or maybe Sandy, what that would mean in terms of what our residents might see in their tax bills or anything like that?
Yeah, so just a quick thing. I wanted to add one thing to the fact that we would be bonding for this. So there's some things you kind of think of as good debt, and you think about it this way. If there's $15 million of expenses the system needs right now, if we were to take a lump of money and pay it right now, there are users over many years that wouldn't necessarily be paying the freight of that. So if you bond for it and there's debt service over 20 years, the users of the system over time are paying for that asset. So someone 10 years from now, we'll be paying a portion of an asset that's going to last for quite some time. So it really is kind of a fair thing as well to spread out the cost of this very significant improvement over years, because the users over time will be paying for the use of that system. So that helps as well.
I just want to clarify, when you say
Yeah.
pay, this is not a tax increase.
No, it's not a tax increase because this is not a voter approved millage. There is no debt millage. There are no additional mills going on top of the mills you pay on your property taxes. This is being paid for as an enterprise fund through the water system. So water rates. People did notice that there was a reconstituting and an increase in your water rates this past July. Council had a rate study, a detailed rate study done last year that came up with 5-year rate study and projections, including how we resituated it with the ready to serve. And this debt is included in that rate study. So no taxes on the property taxes for this. This is coming through your water rates because the users of the system should pay for the water in the system. That's the logic of it. So it all is included in your water rates. There will be some, I mean, obviously at this point, it's not that water rates will be flat, but there was a significant increase. And that does consider the fact that this bonding will be there and there'll be debt service for 20 years on your water infrastructure.
And George, last thing, and then I'll hang up and listen, is there's a cap, I believe, in the amount of money that we can bond with the budget we have that's capped by the state, if I'm not mistaken, and it's somewhere around $60 million.
Yeah, so
What percent of bonding are we at right now?
So for
relative to the cap.
our total cap for capital improvement bonds, which is specifically this type of bond, would be up to 37 million, and we have currently nothing outstanding. I think $100,000.
So on those capital improvements,
We have
37 million, and
37 million. We have essentially zero.
we have zero debt right now.
I think it's 165,000. So there's some debt coming off. We can
I'll
round
round that
down to
down to
zero.
zero. I'm gonna round that down to
We
zero.
are in a very good situation financially
Thank
in
you.
terms of very low debt. So that is, we are, in the fact that we need this, we are in a good situation to absorb the debt. So
So we have ourselves prepared. That's it.
with that, should we switch over, Mr.?
Yeah, why don't we switch over to Miller Canfield?
Well, I had,
If you want more questions,
yeah.
but we're going to
just
open
wanna
up for all questions.
Clarifying, so make sure. So
Sure.
we have the phase one and then the different projects. So the 8.5 and then the 5, well, it's 4 point, yeah, it's rounded to 5. So the things that in the phase one are majority of those, I'm not sure about the last water main replacement along baseline and Katie. Are all of those related to the state order?
The only one that's not is the Katy one.
That's what I wondered why. Okay, but that's just prudent to do in this project grouping.
It'd be for just fiscal year and year for planning.
Mhm.
We've already planned on replacing Katy. At the same time, this would be.
It just makes sense. Okay, so if I look at that, that means the roughly 7.5 million of this 15 million is the state order that we have to do. So it's like that must be done, right?
Yeah.
So, and then these others, and I would say it's equivalent. This is our home, right? And so we've got major plumbing problems and they're so large that we need to take out a loan, which is what the bond is. So, and I also think that these projects, which go in even more detail in the presentations that are online that we've had in the past, this is why there is government. I mean, we have to, providing reliable, safe, clean water is just a paramount importance of a government responsibility to its residents. So, and I fully support this. It's too bad this wasn't done slowly over time, but we have been spending a lot of money every year. But it's like whack-a-mole because we have mains that break, we fix them, pressure goes off, and then another main breaks because it's got to readjust the pressure. So we are basically, good money after bad, right? So this is bringing it to the 21st century and having it last a darn long time. And then hopefully future stewardship as other things need to be replaced, that will become ongoing versus having to take on this monumental task. But the two, so on a minor is the two amounts are 8.5 and 5 million. That only totals 13.5.
So we actually put a 15 million up to when we come back.
Okay.
It's a
So just
3
to
months from
clarify.
now. We may in fact be borrowing less, but we did not want to get to the close point and then have to do another intent. So
I agree completely. I'm
McGowan
just
can
saying,
talk about
somebody's
that.
gonna say, we're
Yeah.
talking about 15, but these two things we're speaking
Right.
to add up to that. Also, it talked about FY 25 and 26, and then potential future bonding, because we've got that balance of work to do. And I know we'll keep trying to get grants or forgiven loans, right? But so far that's not been fruitful. The future bonding is 29-30. What happens in FY 27, 28, or the current notices for that? But these projects that we're talking about, the roughly 15 million, are those happening over the next 4 years? What is the time frame
think
of
it's-
project
it's
completion?
essentially 3.5 to 4 year, 3 years of work.
Okay, so even though, because it says current notice, so somebody might take that as it's going to occur in 25 and 26. In fact, that's over a number of years, but the hope is to start next year season, correct? Is that,
Correct.
okay,
Work will be starting next spring.
It has to be starting.
Yeah, we have a schedule with the state and the consent order.
it is,
We have
to.
every month we have to say we're on schedule or we're falling behind or, yeah.
now, so I'd use the term hell or high water, but that wouldn't be quite a.
Yes.
That is one of the reasons we petitioned the state we got the first $1 million or so from Rosemary Bear to help us on this. She can't give us all. We are, our hands up for 2 or 3 other grants because she's the chair of the water management for the state. That helps us at least get going right now. And she's been out here seeing the facilities, so she knows we're in need. So,
Well, potentially,
thank you.
we have another 11 million on the heels of this in 4 years. So
Mhm.
those efforts for getting those grants or low interest loans are very helpful. So,
Absolutely.
But we just don't, to date, it's not been fruitful.
We
So-
need more seed money. She gave us some. We need.
So that is it. Thank
Great.
you.
Got a couple questions before we move to the bond.
Absolutely.
Just to
Go right ahead,
clarify,
John.
kind of build off of that.
Certainly.
So I'm looking at the April water system improvement and rate setting. And I know we had in that the full plan. So this is the phase 1, phase 2. There we had phase 3, 4, and 5. One, can we talk a little bit on the mix of, because we changed a number of the projects that were in phase 1 and phase 2. I saw we added the lead service lines, which I think is a good improvement as well. But just a brief, what was the logic behind some of the changes that took place, moving items out to phase 3 and pulling others in? And then the second question that's a related one is, we're discussing a bond for phase 1 and phase 2. Is it safe to assume we're not starting any of those projects that are phase 3, 4, and 5 until we would revisit or find those funds? So those are basically, by this math, deferred out, not to 2027, as was highlighted here, but they're really 29 and 30 now. We're deferring those out.
Correct.
Is that a fair statement?
Yes. So the last statement there,
Sorry, I layered a couple
yeah,
questions there,
the-
Mike.
the
Sorry.
2 years that we kind of have a empty space between,
Mhm.
we'll still be doing some capital improvements. We still budget, capital improvements. It'll be smaller projects, probably focus more on like hydrant replacements, valve replacements, and service lines, lead service lines. And another key thing is galvanized lines. That's another item that the state's putting down on us, not just lead, galvanized. For the phasing wise, we've been working with OHM for almost a year now on our street asset management plan. And a lot of that is corresponding with that as well. We don't have a final product of that, but we're trying to work it out where we replace the water main, the infrastructure, we replace the street. Either right then, at the same time, or that street's ready to be replaced when it's time to, because the infrastructure has been replaced. That's also working with other private utilities. We can't go tell consumers or DTE, hey, go replace all the gas lines on these streets so we can repave it. They have their own capital improvement plan as well. So that's why we kind of shifted some things around. Also focus on lead service lines. On the one map, Eaton Drive has a lot of lead and galvanized. Linden as well, and just undersized water main. 4-inch water main that if you were to cut it open, you get probably about 1.5 inches of actual water flow.
Yeah.
So another key things, and Chris touched based on it, is making those looping, those connections. You drive around the community, you see fire hydrants. You're not sure exactly, you don't see underground, you don't know how everything's connected. There's a section of main at bottom of Eaton that's not even connected to 7 Mile. You get that connected, you've increased your flow, your water quality, and fire protection. Same thing over up the upper port of Griswold. There's probably about 300 feet of no water main that we need that connection. That way it'll help prevent some of the water main breaks that we have been having over that area. So.
Okay. That is helpful.
Was that all your questions?
Yep, that actually, you got the questions. I mean, I don't know if I just want to knock out my comments here, or if we want to loop back after, but
Why don't we go to the
I'm
middle of
happy to do
Campfield
that.
and then we'll do overall comments and then I'll open it up. So Pat McGow, you are up, sir. Pat does a lot of this for everybody in the state and the Midwest. I think the township has about 15 million worth of bonding, and that's not even including their $42 million for their new facilities. And they don't own any roads. We own 30 miles of roads and infrastructure. Is that a great opportunity? Go right ahead.
So good evening, Pat McGow here from Miller Canfield, here as the city's bond attorney. So I'm just going to go back a step to what was just discussed with the engineers and to remind the council, which I know you're aware of, about the discussion last spring and the search for other financing opportunities. There were several meetings and hearings last spring before the city applied for the low interest loan funding from the state. As was stated, the state runs a program where they funnel a lot of money, a lot of the ARPA money that has come from the federal government the last couple of years and other direct appropriations into water and sewer improvements. Obviously, water quality has been a big deal in this state ever since the Flint water crisis. And so that drinking water revolving loan program is a great tool if you qualify for it. The problem is it's very sought after. So everybody has to submit their applications in the summer, and the state comes out with a list in September for the next year's funding cycle as to who qualifies and who doesn't. So this year, for the next fiscal year, the list came out and there were 150 applicants, of which the city of Northville was 68. So you were a little bit above the median. Only 30 communities got funded in this cycle. So that was a disappointment because a lot of those federal funds have gone away, and most of those are loans. So a lot of the grants and principal forgiveness that occurred several years ago are really no longer there. So one way or the other, if there's a big capital project, you're going to have to borrow for it. The question is how you borrow for it, what the rates are, the repayment terms, et cetera. But at the end of the day, these types of improvements need to be paid from the users of the system. Most of these water projects are paid from rates charged to the customers. And as the city manager indicated, the idea is that the policy behind that is that the people who are going to be using the water improvements over the next 20 years are the ones paying for it. A lot of people think, well, why didn't you just save enough money and then pay for it in cash up front so you don't have to borrow? And the answer is if you save that money, that meant you were charging the people over the last 20 years too much. So the idea with debt for this type of infrastructure is this is an infrastructure investment and it's going to be paid over the life of the improvement by the people who are actually using the improvement. So let's talk about the bonding. So the project itself, and thank you, Barbara, for the math there, because there are two different components. There's an 8.5 million estimate for phase one, a 5 million estimate for phase two. These are estimates. These are based upon the engineering estimates at the time they were done. And one thing we know is that when construction bids come in, it's going to be different. Very often it comes in higher. And so what we wanted to do was to do a single bonding notice for these first two phases. And the 13.5 million is the estimate. So it was bumped up to 15 million to give a little bit of a cushion. Because the idea is that the idea behind this first financing is to cover those first two phases, which is the next 3 to 4 years of construction. And so that's where that $15 million number came from. The amount that's going to be borrowed is going to be based upon what the bids are. So, and the other thing it's important to say right now is that at this point, we've had a lot of discussions with the city since September when we learned that we weren't going to qualify for the state drinking water loan. And the timing of this is that the first phase construction bids, I think, are supposed to come in next spring, around April. Construction start next year. So the timing would be that the first bond issue would be sometime in the spring so that the bonds are sold after we know how much the first phase costs and before we need the money for it. Now, we have some decisions to make that don't need to be made tonight about how and when to bond. We might decide that it makes sense to bond the full amount of the project in one bond issue next year, or it may get split into two bond issues, say 8.5 million next year, 5 the next, depending upon the actual costs, and also taking a look at market rates and those kinds of things. So those decisions about how much are going to be bonded and when are going to be next year. The action item before you tonight is really to kind of kick off the financing. It's the first step in the bond financing process, which is to indicate an intent to issue bonds in an amount not to exceed $15 million that would pay for these water system improvements, and it would be somewhere for a period not to exceed 25 years. Again, most of the time, water system improvements are done for a 20-year duration or 25-year duration. Under state law, you can borrow for a period not greater than the useful life of the improvements. And water mains have a very long useful life. So, you know, obviously these have been here for over 100 years. Most of the time, the engineers will say that's definitely over 40-year life assets. But you generally don't issue bonds longer than 30 years for most types of projects. And again, water and sewer bonds are usually in the 20 or 25-year range. So that's what's being anticipated with this bond issue. And again, those decisions and the details will be made next spring as we get closer to having the bids and closer to needing to time the sale of the bonds. There are a couple other things that came up during your comments that I just kind of want to talk about. And first, let's talk about the city's debt. The city of Northville has very little debt. For a city of its size that runs water, sewer, all the services that we have, the city only has 2 outstanding bond issues. There is 1 year left on the bonds that were done in 2010 for the DDA streetscape project. So that'll be paid off in the spring, and that's paid from DDA tax increment revenue. So that's not coming from general fund taxes. The other bond issue is the road bond that the voters approved in 2018 that paid for about $3 million worth of road improvements. And that was originally done as a 10-year bond issue, and that is going to be paid off in 2028. Now, that was approved by the voters because the reason to submit a bond issue is to the voters is that you need to get voter approval if you want to get authority to levy a tax to pay the bonds. So you think about school bonds. Every school bond is voted because that allows the school district to levy a debt millage to pay the bonds. In 2018, the city of Northville voted the road bond because that allows the city to levy a debt millage in order to pay the debt service on the bonds. So that money doesn't come from your general operating funds. It comes from a special debt levy that is in an amount necessary to pay that. We are not looking to do that here. The intent here is to use the water revenues to pay the debt service on the bonds. So these bonds are not required to be approved by the voters. Instead, what the process is that there's a process under state law with a lot of these types of bond issues that you are required at the beginning of the process to indicate your intent to issue the bonds with the amount, the project, and the bonds can be issued without a vote of the people at an election unless a referendum petition is signed and submitted to the city clerk within 45 days of publishing this notice. So this is very typical for a lot of different types of bond issues like this, where you don't need and you're not going to raise taxes in order to pay this. So that's what the process is for this type of a bond issue. The other thing that came up was the city's debt limits and borrowing capacity. So cities under state law have the ability to issue bonds backed by taxes up to 10% of the SEV. And there's a couple other things that get added into that. So the city's financial advisors ran that calculation with Sandy's office, and that number is the 10% debt limit is $78 million is the city's legal debt margin. The 10%. Now, this type of a bond issue we're talking about tonight has a separate limit, which is 5%. So that's the 37 or so million that Georgia indicated, which is the amount of debt that could be done as a capital improvement bond like this. Now, that doesn't mean the city could afford to issue $78 million. I like to think of the debt limit as kind of like your credit card limit. That's the most that you can borrow, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can pay that back. But that shows, though, that the city has plenty of capacity to issue debt in the future for other capital projects if it needs to. So this, even though $15 million is a big number for this community in terms of recent bond issues, it's nowhere near the city's ability to issue debt under the city's legal debt limits. It's been said that we really haven't put a lot of money into the water infrastructure. I went back, I mentioned there's only 2 outstanding bond issues. I was looking back through our records. The last time the city did a bond issue for water system improvements was 1990. So that's been over 30 years. And that was a relatively small issue that I think was probably for a water main project. So it's been a long time since the city has issued bonds for water or sewer infrastructure. The other subject that came up here tonight was the bond rating, the city's bond rating. So I will say that it may surprise people to know that the city does not currently have a bond rating. And the reason for that is that bonds are what gets rated by rating agencies, not cities. So I mentioned that the city has 2 outstanding bonds. Bonds are rated by a rating agency, or you're required to get a rating and pay for it if you issue bonds over $1 million and sell it in the bond market. So the reason the city of Northville doesn't have a bond rating is that when we did that road bond in 2018, it was a relatively short issue of 10 years, and it was a better financial deal to directly place that with a bank. And so we didn't have to go get a bond rating. So that was the same way that DDA streetscape bond was refinanced in 2016. So even though there's two different outstanding bond issues, Northville does not have a bond rating. The last time we did was 2016, and the city was rated AA+, which is just one notch below the highest bond rating of AAA. So I know there's speculation about what will our bond rating be. And just to remind you, I'm the lawyer here. I'm not the financial advisor. So there's another side to the team that helps the city on bond issues. The city's financial advisory firm, MFCI, has been working with the city administration talking about bond ratings. And we've really been talking about this for a number of years, so that if and when the city is going to go out for another bond issue, what would that rating be? And certainly the rating agencies have a very formulaic criteria, and the assumptions that the financial advisors have used in some of the number runs that they've done are assuming conservatively we would at least have that AA+ rating that the city had before, and there's hope that we might qualify for AAA. But we will not know the answer to that until we get about 2 or 3 weeks before we actually go to sell bonds. But as Councilman Carter said, there's a lot of criteria that go into that, most of which are not in your control, but the ones that are in your control are very favorable. So that's something we won't know the answer to that until the spring. But even with a AA+ bond rating or AAA, the difference between them is relatively small in terms of interest rate. But that allows the city to borrow for long-term infrastructure improvements at a relatively low rate. So again, we won't know what the interest rate on the bonds will be until we go to sell bonds in the spring. Right now, the estimates that have been used have a 20-year bond under 4%. I think today they reran numbers at about a 3.90. And if we were to do a 25-year bond, it'd be a little over 4%. So still, that's a very good low interest rate in terms of long-term to be issuing, 20-year debt for whatever that ends up being in terms of the amount. So that'll be determined next spring when we go and finalize the bond issue. So the last thing I just want to talk about here is the bond issue itself and what the structure is. So I mentioned that these bonds are intended to be paid from the water system rates and charges. However, in order to get the benefit of the city's bond rating, what we're recommending is the city issue capital improvement bonds, which are bonds which are backed by the city's full faith and credit. You are pledging your general fund revenues and taxing power for repayment of the bonds, but you're not intending to use the water revenues, because there's really a couple different categories of bonds that we could have issued for this project. Revenue bonds, which you may have heard, are bonds which are solely payable from the rates and charges generated by the system. And there are lots of examples of communities that issue revenue bonds for their projects. General obligation bonds are bonds that are payable or actually pledge the city's full faith and credit and taxing power. Revenue bonds generally are a little more expensive to issue for a couple of reasons. First, the interest rates on revenue bonds is a little bit higher than on a general obligation bond. And I would also add that your credit rating on a revenue bond probably wouldn't be AA+. The financial advisors estimated it might be AA-. So it would be sort of 2 notches below. When you issue revenue bonds, you also have to borrow more to fund a reserve fund in case you have a shortfall, because the only security is the revenues. So a revenue bond that's sold in the bond market has a reserve fund set aside in case there's a shortfall in revenues in a year. So it generally requires you to borrow a little more. You generally pay a little higher interest rate. And so the recommendation here to get the lowest cost of borrowing to the city and take advantage of the city's credit rating is to issue capital improvement bonds, which are, again, backed by the city's full faith and credit, even though you're going to use the water revenues to pay that. So what you have before you tonight is a notice of intent resolution to issue capital improvement bonds in an amount not to exceed $15 million in one or more series to pay all or part of the costs of acquiring, constructing, and equipping various water system projects for the city, including water main replacements and improvements, booster station improvements, reservoir improvements, and lead service line replacements, together with all related site improvements. That's the language that's in the resolution. That's also the language that's going to be in the notice that's going to be published. So this resolution authorizes the city clerk to then publish a notice in the newspaper that indicates the intent to issue the bonds, the amount, the project, and states the referendum right that they can be issued without a vote unless a petition is signed by 10% of the registered electors and filed within 45 days. So that's the action item before you. The other thing that the resolution does is it states the intent to issue tax exempt bonds. So any costs that have been incurred along the way for the engineering, design, and if there are any costs that are paid before the bonds are issued, can then also be reimbursed from the bonds when they're actually issued. So the idea is that this bond issue is going to pay for the cost of the engineering and construction costs. Now, you could decide to use cash if you needed to, but right now we wanted to provide the most flexibility in the resolution in this preliminary step. And then when we come back in the spring to authorize the bonds, we'll have more details about the timing, the sizing, et cetera. So that is what is before you tonight with the notice of intent resolution. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions related to the bonding process, the resolution, or anything else for the project.
Thank you, Pat. I'd open up any questions for Pat or others or comments.
You just made it sound so simple. Thank you.
Well, good.
I wish I would have called you Friday, but mine are more emotional. The people, people have these questions that go unanswered, and so they it spirals, myself included. And for if there's a group of people that do, let's say, sign the petition, they get 500 some signatures. What will that do? That just delays the inevitable. We still have to do this.
You still have to do it because, as been said several times, the state is ordering the city to do this.
Okay.
And this timetable is actually part of that order.
Right.
Having certain steps done along the way.
Okay. And then as far as like transparency and trust in us as a group, with the voting aspect of it, like you just said, it's not required to go to a vote, because in the end, we would just have, if it was voted down, we would still have to go back to the drawing board and do this.
We would have to find a different way to do this, which would probably be more expensive.
And this is the cheapest way.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Anything, Andrew?
Nope, I'm all set. Thank you, Pat.
Any other questions?
Yeah, as always with this group, going last is an advantage. One, I'll just note, we all heard Mr. McGow say that we're gonna get a AAA bond rating. right?
We did. I have it on tape.
Make
Thank
sure
you.
you guys
Duly
all heard
noted,
that as
President.
well.
Thank you,
Make sure
Pat.
that's reflected in the
Good.
minutes.
Yes.
First, historic towns come with historic infrastructure. We've got to be aware of that. We've got to plan accordingly. One thing that I want to highlight is water rates and charges need to be tied to improvements. And our water system needs to be a self-sustaining system. So we should not be trying to fund our water system out of our general fund. That is a path to financial ruin, because we can't control the fluctuations that may come within other expenditures or revenue, but that water infrastructure bill is going to be due every single month. And just like our home finances, and you need to line that up. Beyond that, I do agree with everything that's been said, that a capital expenditure should be spread over the life of the system so that the users are the ones that end up ultimately paying for it. Sorry, kid, but you're gonna have to pay your share back there.
You are. That's you, Georgia.
With all that being said, the increase in water bills. So I will recognize the fact that the frustration that has been expressed related to that is real and it's understandable. I think we need to be cognizant of it. I can tell you that the first water bill that came in led to quite a lively conversation at my dinner table. And we need to make sure we're recognizing that and planning for it accordingly. These are not easy decisions that we need to make. Now, the one thing that I would note is there's been some questions of, well, I thought the increase in my water bill was the thing that was paying for the infrastructure. And I think it's an important clarification to get out there that it is. That the water rate schedule that we reviewed back in April was recognizing the fact that we were going to need this bond, that we were going to need to make these investments, and we needed to start accruing revenue that then would be able to pay the debt that then would be utilized to do these improvements within our infrastructure. So that is, it's an important clarification, because I don't want people thinking, well, wait a minute, why am I now paying more in water? And then I'm also hearing about this bond as this additional bills and fees that are going to come on top. So that linkage is very important. With regard to the ballot initiative discussion, I think Councilperson Janetti just kind of teed this up. I'll actually read the consent order because I think it's important. A routine inspection conducted on February 10th and 11th, 2022 by the Michigan Department of Environmental, Great Lakes and Energy, EGLE, identified alleged significant deficiencies related to our underground finished water reservoir. As required by the Safe Drinking Water Act, we are required to take action to correct these deficiencies. These deficiencies are considered significant, but not an emergency to the city's drinking water. Also an important note in that. The note below that did say failure to resolve can result in fines by the state up to a daily basis of levy. So this can move pretty quickly on us if we ignore the consent order and we don't get this issue resolved. So I always come back, we can debate. I think most of the people in this room know that I love to debate. In fact, several of us have sat outside for hours after these meetings, continuing the debate. And when it's talking about the farmer's market, Riverwalk, Ford Field, we can always have back and forths because we have to live within our means and there's trade-offs in every conversation we have. Water infrastructure, especially the items that we've noted, is a requirement. We've honestly, somewhat admirably, there has been an effort to patch and maintain this system over generations. To take what Mr. McGow just said, if our next bond related to water was in 30 years, then it's likely that my daughter's the one sitting up in this chair because he'd be my age. That's how long just for the last one.
Right here in the middle.
Probably. If we think of the sequencing though, that's how long just for the last bond. And then we go back to the 60s with some of the infrastructure that's currently in place. That's like saying we're looking at 2090 in the other direction of when the infrastructure we're building today is going to need to be replaced. Now, things don't last as long as they used to, so it may not make it to that point. But when we talk about the underground reservoir and pump house, which has the significant deficiencies, establishing proper pressure districts, which existing PRVs are inoperable, in improper isolation districts and variable pressure and flows creating a fire hazard. The water main replacement and looping, which does result in gaps where if a line goes down, water is lost to an entire area because you can't reroute water, which also is a fire hazard that'll come through because if water line gets cut off and you can't loop water around, now you have a district of homes that are not protected. And then the last item is the lead and galvanized service lines, which I was happy to hear we're moving that up and making sure we're prioritizing it. I think the entire state has learned that as a priority that we need to proactively resolve and that can remove that the water we're drinking is safe. So, I had a resident, longtime Northville resident, make a comment to me that no one can fight like us, but in the end we come together and we do the hard things when they're necessary. Water infrastructure like this is a generational improvement. The bond will spread that out and help us manage it over time. But I think this is something we have to do, not just for us, but with the long term in mind.
Thanks, John. Any other comments?
Well said.
Yep.
Thank you very much, John. I agree with everything he said. I have a very minor question, and I'm going to echo what Laura said as well. This is a very complex topic, and thank you for the way you explain it to us.
Yes.
It becomes so clear. And so really appreciate that. Minor, so I have a question about what we're going to be voting on soon is it's general obligation limited tax bonds. It gives us the flexibility to issue and sell. It could be one or more, right, as needed. And you mentioned capital improvement bond, but that is a type under that general obligation, correct? Is that a way to?
It is,
I mean,
yes.
simple in my mind.
General obligation is kind of a category of bonds, and capital improvement is a certain type under a specific statute that lets you do this.
Right.
And I'm gonna go one step furder,
Okay.
because, which is there's
Going wild.
2 flavors of general obligation bonds in Michigan. So unlimited tax general obligation is what we call the road bonds, because that allows the city to levy a debt millage at whatever rate it needs to pay the debt service. So those are called unlimited tax general obligations. Because the voters approve those bonds, you can and have to levy a debt millage at whatever rate.
And you see that on our tax bill.
Right. And
Yeah,
that
as a
goes up
separate
and
line
down.
item.
It's been
Right.
going down as the taxable values have increased over the years. A limited tax general obligation bond is what this is. which is because it's not approved by the voters, you cannot raise taxes above your existing charter limits in order to pay this back. So that's what the word limited means there. It's a limited tax pledge of the city. You can't raise taxes above your charter limit. Whereas a voted bond is an unlimited tax. Now, again, we're not intending to pay this bond with taxes, and because from a fairness standpoint, it's for the water system, so you want it to be paid by the water customers.
You say we're not intending to, we will not,
Correct.
distinctly, just.
And I say it that way.
Because you're a really good lawyer.
Well, I say it that way because how are you going to pay it back and what is securing the bonds are two different things. To the investors, they're not going to look at the city's water system when they evaluate this. They're looking at the city's general credit rating, and they know the city of Northville has this. They're going to use whatever money they have, even if they have to use taxes. We don't intend to do that. But that's what the security is to them. At this table, it's coming from the water system rates and charges. So that's why I use those terms.
Much appreciated.
Great.
And following that, the other was that revenue bond, that is not, because it says here, issuance of one or two series of general obligation bonds or revenue bonds, but that the final details have not yet been determined. But what our Exhibit A tonight we're approving is not related to a revenue bond, correct?
Correct. I don't know what you were reading. It said general obligation or revenue bond.
It was your letter.
Oh, that was back in September when we had.
Just clarifying that we're not, because
Yes, there were a lot of discussions with the city administration and finance team over how to structure this. And when we started the conversation, it wasn't clear which way we.
Yeah, but anybody picking this up cold, it was September 9th, just clarified that has changed, that's why we're moving forward with this plan. And certainly the way you summarized a revenue bond, it doesn't seem prudent way to go for multiple reasons.
Not for Northville, no.
Correct. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Stay close back there. I'm going to open it up for a public comment. This is time, public comment, not Q&A. Come right up, full name and address, and if you need to. Okay. You might have to bring that mic down just a little bit. That's afterwards. Thank you.
Susan Plaga, East Main, Northville.
Absolutely.
This is a question. I know you can't answer it and common knowledge is you'll get back to me. You're talking about this bond and all this, and you've been out of compliance for a while. Why are you even thinking about bonds and stuff? And you're thinking about putting millions of dollars into Ford Field and putting a band shelter over in the farmer's market. Why aren't we using some, I'm not saying all of it, John, some of that money and lower that bond? Second thing is, you've already raised the water rates 10%. When Hunter Pasteur builds those wonderful homes they want to build, is that going to come down, that percentage, when they start paying? Or are they never going to start paying? Are you just going to keep raising it? Those are questions that somebody's got to think about besides me. And as you have a couple of your colleagues have to inform me, I'm not a resident. I'm just a tenant. Got news for you. Pay your bills.
Absolutely. Thank you. Anybody else at this time? Nancy.
Nancy Darga, 516 North Center Street. I wasn't planning on speaking today. I was here for moral support, but
Bless you.
Something was said that I need to make a correction of, and Mr. Kranz, you implied that the former leaders who sat up at this table that you are currently sitting at did not address these water needs earlier. And I can assure you that 100-year-old system didn't last 100 years because its maintenance needs were not addressed.
That's not an answer.
And I can also assure you that the city is finding themselves with no debt because of the bold strategy that the former leaders of this city did take.
Absolutely.
And I can also assure you that we reduced our liabilities and you now are benefiting for a 97% payment of your pension fund once again for the strong and bold steps that the people at in that front desk took previously. And I want to assure you that since 1998, when the Michigan Recovery Fund was established, this city made multiple, countless applications for that money. And one of the reasons we have just secured a $1.15 million water improvement fund is because we once again decided to go through the back door to try to get some money, and we won for once. We also secured $600,000 worth of money to pay for the lead lines because we stayed up until midnight arguing in a budget hearing, and we need to give credit to Senator Rosemary Bear, who came out of that hearing black and blue, but she got us the 1.15 and she got us the 600,000. And Matt Colazar also deserves our gratitude because he got us 750,000 to repair that High Street Bridge over the Randolph Drain. In so saying so, I just wanted you to know that I served up there for 12 years and had to deal with multiple budget catastrophes. And I'm proud to say that we never raised the taxes. We kept the debt down to almost a minimal, and we consistently improved the city. If I was still sitting up there, I would full-heartedly vote in support of going for a bond because it's the cheapest, fastest, and legally sound solution to the problem that we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Anybody else? This is your time. It's all yours.
Billy Burns, 392 Fairbrook Court. So I do really appreciate the discussion and the clarifications you guys have provided. It's been super helpful, and hopefully a lot of people watch this. I do have a few comments and a couple of questions I know you can't answer. So I recognize it's a necessary expenditure, but the optics of passing a $15 million bond issuance aren't great when you consider a few things. We've known about it for years. We're spending millions on things like Ford Field, the roundabout, new farmers market location and building. We're presumably losing out on state revenue by keeping Main and Center closed. We're not going to see incremental tax revenue from the Downs project for potentially a decade because of the brownfield plan, tax abatement. And along those lines, though, it sounds like this will be a user fee. So it's not like Hunter Pastoral getting paid back their TIF at an accelerator rate. So that's good to hear. But my question there is what happens to my fee when we automatically flip a switch and with 500 plus new residents? Is it flat rate? Is it pro rata? Do we just pay down the debt faster if we had all those new citizens? Even if we had remained in the same home over the past 3 years, your property taxes have gone up on a compound basis, roughly 14%. That's the highest in a 3-year period since Prop A took effect in 95. All that to be said, like most loans we have to take out in real life, you could have put a down payment on it. And finally, we say it's not a tax, and by definition, it's not, but it is money out of every citizen's pocket that is incremental to what they're paying. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy. Anybody else at this time? Going once? So come right up, Mary.
Mary Ortiz, 502 West Main. Well, I'm confused. I don't dispute that our water infrastructure needs serious attention. I know that it's needed attention and portions replaced for decades. I don't have an issue with that. It's a good thing to fix it. Don't have a problem with that. No road bonds are coming. Our roads and our sidewalks are a mess. We need to take care of those things too. I think maybe the problem is, among other things, there's the inconsistency and issues with the way you're communicating. And you'll notice you're describing this as a tax bond, but then you're telling us it's not a tax. What is it? Okay, so then we have had this increase, which was supposed to be only 10 to 20% over our usual water bill, but it wasn't. Okay, so we have a hard time trusting that this is it's called one thing. Now you're telling us it's something else, or we've already kind of paid for it. But that didn't prove true before. So then I was very disturbed when I read the notice from the city that you were going to bypass the referendum and just go to this new strategy so you could bypass the voters. It sounded like to me. Okay, so, and then there was only a 45-day window where the taxpayers had any recourse, which did not seem appropriate to me since we have Thanksgiving and Christmas coming up. It didn't seem like if things were as they appeared, which they may not, after listening to everyone here, that seemed like a gamesmanship that would only really undermine the public trust. So Mayor Pro Tem says we're not intending to versus we will not. Okay, so we need more than a verbal commitment about that. Okay, and then if you go back and look at things in the past, that what was said and documented on September 9th is no longer the case. That needs to be in writing somewhere. Okay, you can't just give us all this information and say, oh yeah, that doesn't count anymore. It's very confusing to us taxpayers. And then you say, we will have 800 new neighbors at the Downs who will be paying. But that isn't it one commercial building who will be paying one bill, not 800? I don't know. There's a lot that I don't understand. There's phase 2. It looks like, in the past information that I read is for the Downs. And I don't understand. Councilman Carter did the best to try and assuage me in feeling like the worst has already happened, that this increase that we've had that has been a shock to our system is going to be what we're going to be experiencing, but I'm confused. And if I'm confused, other people are confused too. I think your communication really needs to be improved. I think it needs to be a door-to-door written communication. The website is very hard to manage. People don't read it, and some of the other social media, a lot of people don't read it either. I think that this amount of money deserves direct communication in writing.
Thank you, Mary. Anybody else? Jeff?
Hi, Jeff Snyder, 508 Gardner Street. A couple of things first. First of all, I want to thank you guys for keeping Griswold closed for the last, on so many months. Our neighborhood traffic has been like back to the old days. So thank you very much. I assume that's permanent.
Duly noted. We appreciate
Second
that.
thing,
Similar to our AAA bond
yeah,
rating.
second, I was very upset to hear that my water pressure might come down in my neighborhood, even from 120 to 100. My shower is awesome right now.
It is.
Very upset about that.
And in the historic area.
But to pick up on a couple other comments, when you read this, that 10-page pack, there's multiple references to tax. So if you come out here with a vote, which appears like you may, you have to be talking to a lot of people and describing to them that, oh, no, it's not a tax, there's already pretty high level of distrust, And so, and just read on further surface, the bonds will be issued without a vote of the electors, right? This just doesn't sound right, And tax. And I know what you're saying, but maybe next time leave that word out of your letters, So, but I think, tomorrow you're gonna, I hope you don't trigger, petition, because that would just delay it. Would it make sense? Would it make sense just to vote to go to a referendum now and have it in August versus, is that really that 4 or 5 months going to make a big difference? But let the citizens speak to this, So just a question, but I hate to see it delayed to next August. August means it's a year away by the time we get to construction.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate
By
it.
the way, I support everything said tonight, regarding the needs. We need it and we need more. So.
Thank you, Jeff. Is there anybody else at this time? Going once, going twice? Roxanne, are you coming up? Take your time. Bring it down.
I really don't have a lot to say. I just want to say, I agree with put it in writing. Take enough time, slow it down, month or two, get it in writing exactly what it's going to mean. And and make sure people understand it's not tax.
Good point. Thank you, Roxanne. Is there any other comments? We've heard from just about everybody. Going once, going twice. I am closing off public comments. New business, in your package, is there any other discussion before I'm going to ask for a notice of intent for resolution?
A couple clarifications.
Yeah, any clarifications, any clarifying questions here? Go right ahead.
In terms of the notice,
So stay loose, everybody who spoke so far.
the notice that we basically voting on
Yes.
is that this is to Mr. McGow. No, you don't, well, I guess then you can hear, I'm sorry, I was gonna say, you just. So the notice has in it specifically, it's a general obligation limited tax bond, which you described when I asked that question. It has to legally use the term tax bond, correct?
It does.
Okay.
And again, I'll just say that maybe a little differently. The city is calling it a general obligation limited tax bond because that's what we're telling the investors is being pledged for the repayment, because that's going to give us the lowest interest rate, the lowest borrowing cost. It's going to be paid from rates and charges.
And essentially, the city's general obligation is the backstop for the revenue. So that makes the buyers of the bond know that it will be paid. It doesn't mean we ever have to use it or intend to use it. And the limited obligation comes from the fact that if the city were going to go over your Headley limit right now, you would need to go to the voters to ask for more money, to have a vote of the people to raise more taxes. So this can't raise the taxes without going back to our residents, right?
Correct.
You could use tax revenue that is existing within our existing mills, but we couldn't add mills without going back to, for any purpose, without going back to our residents.
Correct.
So that's the.
And just and going back, there's the phase 1 and phase 2. I think we're set. I just had that one question.
Can I just expand on that maybe a little bit?
You can.
Say it a little differently.
Go right ahead.
Because it sounds like there's some confusion over, is it from taxes, is it not? And the answer is that, when we use these term taxes and user charges, people are paying it. It's just two different sources. Taxes are what you pay based upon the value of your real estate property on your homeowner bills, tax bills. User charges is what you pay for water usage. So big industrial and commercial users use more water. They're going to pay a bigger percentage of this than a single family home that uses less. It's very typical for water and sewer improvements to be paid from those user charges and not taxes, because from a policy standpoint, that's who's using the improvement. However, we're trying to get the lowest cost of financing here, which is why we're doing a bond that is secured by the city's taxes, but it's not going to be paid from taxes. I know that sounds confusing, and we have to say it's a tax-backed bond because that is the security. But the reality is that you're going to take that money out of the water system. And you've already implemented a rate increase, which is designed to go towards this debt service, which will be paid over the next 25 years.
Pat, can you clarify? I think you said something very important there, is you wouldn't pull this out of the general fund because you're looking at a different pool of users and payers that's not aligned with what the general fund would be. So when we're talking about other projects that were being brought up, those are general fund and other areas of the budget. This is tied to the actual users of the system that are charged based on consumption.
Yeah, correct. And I'll say that a little differently. I mean,
Please,
so
yeah, you're better
some
than
of
I
these other projects like Ford Field and the parks and these, you've got grant funds for those specific purposes that couldn't be used to fix your water bills.
Correct.
Likewise, the money that you charge water customers can't be used to pay for parks or streets or other improvements. Water user charges have to be spent on the water system. So even though, well, you're
And
spending money
Georgia,
on
as you
other
leave,
projects,
thank you for doing the Pledge of Allegiance. See you later. Thank
you have to match up the revenue source with what it can be used for. And different city revenues can be used for different things. So that can be sometimes confusing. But here, again, this is from user charges of the water system that can really only be spent on water system costs.
Yep, okay. No, thank you for restating that.
Any other clarifications?
Just clarification. So when I look at the phase 1, phase 2, this is for the first series for the estimated up to $15 million. It was mentioned there is nothing on these two that is the downs is being done because of the downs.
Right.
And if somebody notices that there's something along East Katy, there is work along East Katy, but East Katy needed work done. And the city, to the extent that HP had to do something lesser for their project, they paid for that. So, but we piggyback on it to be able to get other stuff done, particularly as it relates to that far south, eastern side, in the Bealtown area and those. So it just made sense and it helped builds up Griswold. So this is not, this 13.5 million up to 15, is not related to the downs
So,
development.
and can I piggyback on that? Or
Yes.
I don't want to cut you off.
No, I'm set.
Okay, so I also want to mention that we have about 2,500, I think, ratepayers or households that pay, businesses and households. If we add 400 or so, or 350 or so, the fixed costs of the water tower, the infrastructure, this $15 million and the work beyond it will be divided amongst more ratepayers. So all it can do is help the system overall. They're going to pay for their own water, but they're also going to help the fixed costs of the system, which is Mike and his crew's people that go out and do the water billing, all that is going to be divided amongst more ratepayers. So having more ratepayers join the system means they're picking up more of the costs and helping with the costs. So they will assist in the costs, not raise the costs. As long as you don't need to add new infrastructure, which we heard from the rate model, we're 20 years out and you don't need to add more infrastructure. So it actually is a net benefit having more customers come online. It doesn't hurt the city, it helps the city.
Good point.
And if
Thank you,
I
Joy.
think back to the rate structure, when we passed that, the rate change, both the way, the way it's structured and the amount that's paid, the percent, that doesn't change over time either, correct? We already have that set. In fact, I can't remember how many years we projected it out to, but it was a number of years.
It was a 5-year rate
It
study.
was a 5-year. So there is not a planned, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
oh, now the Downs is coming into this. This is our rate structure. They just become a part of the system of paying for that service. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there are increases over time in the system, but it is the adopted system that you've already seen. And people coming into the Downs should only help that system have potentially lesser increases, potentially.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
A couple other quick clarifying questions. And these are probably more for the city manager and DPW director. So if you want to sit down, you don't have
Don't get comfortable.
Sorry.
one is I'm looking back. I know this is probably a nightmare to look back at like the deck from April when we did the rate increase discussion. But we had a note in there that said post-application grant funding, increasing user base and additional funding sources could reduce user rate increases. Were we, when we were going through and doing that rate study analysis, assuming the additional residents that live within the Downs? Or is the expectation that those residents, when they come in, will bring down the cost and that should help? So I'm in part trying to address some of the comments from earlier.
It's what you said, that we expect that when they come on, it will assist. It won't make it, it will be what we're projecting or better, not worse.
Okay. And then the second is from a timing perspective, with the administrative consent order on the underground reservoir and the pump house, what is the timing of when we need to start those projects? That's that one specifically because it's tied to the ACO.
It's Mike or.
June.
Okay, so the comment from Director Dominy was June. I know we had the discussion earlier, but that's part of the impetus of why we need to have this conversation today. Because we need to ultimately have that in place, either funded through this bond or through our general fund, which again, I think would be a terrible idea and in fact, virtually impossible. But we ultimately would have to do that or we'll start paying fines from the state. So that's also as we think through the timing of why now versus if we do a ballot initiative and the implications that could have.
Or even waiting a couple months.
Right.
Because there's just a timeline to get this.
And I know the feedback, it's always a last
and
minute.
fines,
I understand that dynamic and the frustrations around it, but this is one where we do have a defined timeline that's set by the state that we're working against as well.
Any other comments here from council? Going once up here. Well, you have a sample motion in your package. You have read this inside and out. We've looked back 3 different presentations and we have the latest one. And appreciate your edification to us today, Pat. It was great. It was great information for those online and those here too. So I'm looking forward to having a motion on the table.
Yeah, Mayor, I move that the Northville City Council adopt the attached resolution authorizing the city clerk to proceed with publishing the notice of intent to issue bonds in the amount not to exceed $15 million.
Support.
We have a motion properly supported. Any other discussion on this motion? Why don't we do a roll call vote on that, please, clerk?
Carter,
Yes.
Janetti,
Yes.
Krenz.
Yes.
Maraski Brown,
Yes.
Turnbull.
Yes. Thank you very much for all the work. I know you've been reading about these for the past 6 or 8 months and over the last 2 years looking at it. Going to number 10, if you're still out there, Mayor and Council Communications. 1, Santa Parade on Friday night. Be there, be square. 6:30. We have the Greens Fair going on in downtown. We're giving the key to Santa at about 7:15. Be there. Some of you, this is our last meeting before Thanksgiving. The community does a Thanksgiving over at the Methodist Church, and a lot of the churches are involved. Those in need, those families, us who are still around are there. There's a couple hundred people there last year. It was a great event, and we actually watched the Detroit Lions too. So it's 12-2. If anybody's around, or if you want to help, or if you just want to come to eat, 12 o'clock at the Methodist Church. It was a great event last year. They're trying to make it better. All the churches are involved and others in civic concern. And 4th, Rotary is selling Goodfellow papers, and all those proceeds this Saturday will go to civic concerns. So if you're out there seeing those people sell a paper, buy a paper from them. So that's all I have. Anything else?
Mine, for anyone who would like to continue the conversation or have a true Q&A, 6 p.m. at Los Tres Amigos will be, I guess, is it still 6:30? My apologies.
You'll be there with him at
friendly amendment accepted. You can come at 6. There's chips and salsa. But 6:30, I don't know if it's still coffee with council, but Councilmember Krenz and myself will be there, happy to continue the conversation. That is on Thursday night. Additionally, just wanted to call out that our state champion high school boys cross country team finished 6th at the Nike Cross Country National Regional as well last weekend. So they continue to do phenomenally well.
Great.
And then I have the fortune of taking a group of elementary and middle school kids. We're taking 23 down to cross country nationals in Lexington, Kentucky this weekend. So expect an obnoxious update in a coming meeting based on some of those kids' performances as well.
Super. Thank you, John. Anybody else?
Oh, we have a special birthday tomorrow. It's George's birthday.
George's birthday tomorrow. Happy birthday indeed. Thank you. Don't take the day off, but happy birthday. We're good. Anybody else?
Just real quick, planning tomorrow evening, we're gonna look at some possible updates to site plan at Downs as a presentation.
At Planning Commission.
So if you're interested in that, please come by. Already noted, it's also with council Thursday at 6:30. And then December 4th, outside of the post office is the bell ringing for the Little Red Jug and Salvation Army. So come by, hit the post office then, especially at 2:30 to 3 o'clock for no particular reason, because you definitely don't want to stuff that between only 2:30 and 3 when we'll be there with a dog and music and everything else. So that's it.
Great.
Sounds like a challenge, Carter.
Yeah.
Hey, I just heard he salted dancing on Thursday.
Is
So
it margarita with
Gonna be
people?
the
Okay.
nerd.
The last thing I've heard from a lot of the council members or the other boards,
Bell ring?
they asked, could they start their meetings a little earlier? So we're looking at that at 6:30 for Planning Commission and others. I've heard from 3 or 4 people in the past week or two. Is that something
Yeah,
that brought
so
up to you and brought up to me?
What it came to be was that the DDA had a discussion amongst the group if they thought 8:30 would work better for the board. And it turns out instead of 8 o'clock, 8:30 worked better. So the question came up from several boards and through staff people was, with the setting of the calendars, should the board be able to discuss maybe moving from 7 to 6:30 or just leave it at 7 or everyone moves? And it's a conversation really, because obviously council, these boards and commissions report up to council. And perhaps at some point, council could have a conversation to see if you have a strong preference either way, if you let the commission decide, or if you have strong, bias for consistency, or if you want to let them see what works for themselves.
I'm fully supportive if they want to move to
You wanna-
6:30, but we'll have that discussion. A lot of them have come and said that so they can start earlier to get done earlier to get back. So I have no problem with that.
And it's not 6:30 is not too early for people that work to be able to get there. So
Give those comments. Good. I'd like for a motion for adjournment. Do I have?
So moved.
Second?
support.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We are done.